And Vista was your project too?
No, God, no, stop. Don't accuse me of that. This whole point is because I didn't work on it. But it's okay because I have Windows 8 that I have to admit I worked on, which half the people listening will be like, yeah, that was something.
All right, so for today's episode of Breaking Changes, I'm really excited to welcome Steven Sinofsky, someone that I looked up to as a scary looming figure for a long time before I actually met him, and I continue to really like everything Steven says.
So, are you still scared? I need to know that now.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
I feel people like to be scary, so yeah, if I stopped being scary to people, I think I would have to work on myself a lot. So so Steven has seen lots of breaking changes, introduced lots of breaking changes himself. Good person to talk about the theme of this season. And so we'll just start, Steven, by having you tell everybody a little bit about yourself. Who are you? How did you get here?
Sure. Well, first, it's super fun to be here and get to chat with you again. So, I don't know, where do you start? If I go way, way back, I started in computing, in the very early 1980s when the first personal computers were sort of arriving. I had my Atari and I wrote basic programs and that kind of stuff. And, but oddly, I got really into business software very early and even before college. And so I was busy writing inventory and accounts receivable kind of programs for my family's business. And then I went to college and graduate school where I studied computer science and then chemistry in college as well. And then in graduate school, I was in computer science. And then I dropped out of the PhD program and got a job at Microsoft. And so that was in 1989. The company was about 3,000 people. Then it had been public for about 18 months when I interviewed, and here I am. And so I was there for over 23 years, and then decided that I wanted to see the other side of the innovation world that existed outside of Seattle, and ended up hanging out in Silicon Valley a bunch as well, and that's how we met too.
Cool. Thanks, Steven. So the big theme of the season, as you may know, is engineering leadership. So I'm asking everyone, how did you get into engineering leadership? Was it a conscious decision or did it just sort of happen to you?
Well, it's super interesting. So I got hired as a software design engineer. And so I got hired to write object-oriented code, which was like a brand new thing.
Very hot at the time. Very hot at the time.
It was super hot. It was on the cover of Business Week magazine. I always use that as an example. It was the new thing that was going to make programming so easy a baby could program. And so the cover of Business Week was literally a cartoon of a baby in diapers programming.
Oh my gosh.
That was the promise of object-oriented programming. Now, the most interesting thing that was going on was Steve Jobs had left Apple, left being a polite way of saying he was fired. And he started another company called Next Computer, and they had built this very sleek workstation style computer, but it was object oriented through and through. And of course, that whole platform ended up becoming the iPhone, and then the Mac, or the Mac, and then the iPhone, and so on. But I was just an engineer. I was hired onto a team of 3 people doing this experimental object oriented programming stuff, and then our team, in some weird corporate thing, and of course I was 22, I had no idea what was going on, got merged with another team. Now this other team was also doing object-oriented stuff, but they were like the star-studded super team that had come over from the platforms group, and we were sort of in the applications group. This team was made up of what were already Microsoft legends. One of the guys was Neil Konzen, and he had developed all the graphical stuff in Windows, what was called User, all the dialogues in Windows. But he was such a legend. He had lived down the street from Microsoft and actually biked to work because he was still in high school when he started, and wrote the Z80, built the Z80 emulator card for Apple II so they could run Microsoft software, all this crazy stuff. And then he was really famous because the first two letters of every Excel file were NK, which were his initials. And that's how DOS, we could tell if a file was an Excel file. So I had to work with people like that. And I knew nothing about anything because I had like done nothing remotely commercial. I'd written papers like on garbage collection and object-oriented persistent databases and stuff like that. So we screwed around for like a year and got nothing done. Had a big meeting with Bill, and he was very upset, but very calm and collected, and was like, well, the Steve Jobs thing is killing us in the market. Everybody says this is the future of the market. So we need to go and reset. And we did a whole big project reset. And I tell this whole story in my Substack, but one of the things we had to do was build a whole team, which we'll get to, I think, in a minute. But what we decided to do was just ship something. And this something was like literally a trivial subset of our grand vision. And at one point, it was just sort of, everybody was sort of down and it was a hassle. And I went to my manager, who was this guy named Jeff Harbers. And Jeff was like the original manager of all of Microsoft's applications. So what was called Multiplan and Word and other things for DOS. And I went to Jeff and I said, can I be like the project manager for this thing? Because nobody cares about it. And it's really small. And turned out I had written most of that code because it was all the low level C++ stuff for like doing files and string classes and things like that. And Jeff was like very serious about management. Like, in fact, one of the reasons this is such an interesting thing was because Jeff had managed the Windows Word 1.0 project, which was like a legendary failure of a project that took like 6 years when in fact it was supposed to take like 6 months because all programs take like 6 months. And in fact, Jeff quit like 2/3 of the way through the project, and a big ball of fire where he basically told the team they were the worst team ever at Microsoft and all this other stuff. It's all documented in this like famous Harvard Business School case. And Jeff came back. He spent like a year like being zen and finding himself, and then came back and Bill assigned him to fix this object-oriented programming mess. And so he was very serious about management and what to do and who to manage. So it was kind of weird that he said yes to me. And then I became an engineering manager. And it was kind of weird because I managed 2 people. One of them was a fellow college hire who left like 2 years later, but was an Apple, and he's been at Apple ever since. And then the other was like one of the 4 people on the original Excel team who needed a manager like a hole in the head. Like, he had no use for me at all. And so that was Rick. But Rick was great. We would talk all night, like every week, like we would just hang out chatting about stuff. And so that was how I became an engineering manager. Wow. And that was that. It was a weird story where, sort of part of the lesson is just asking. Part of the lesson is having a boss who was supportive, but he was very, very serious about managing. And at that time at Microsoft, and for many years, it was always my philosophy, managers were just like people who could program like 4 days a week and then use the extra time to get 5 days worth of work done in 4 days, and then use the extra time to just sort of manage. And that was sort of the culture at the time. So
were you still hands-on programming after becoming a manager?
Oh yeah, I was doing like all of the stuff for this project. There were only 2 of us at that point because everybody else was on the next version already.
Well, what about the third guy on the team?
By then we were now these joined together, and we were like 8, and we were building the first set of classes for C++ version 7 at Microsoft, which was really version 1 of C++. But we were also building like all of the graphical classes that would be used in the second version. And we were also building the tooling for using those graphical classes. And all of that was going on at the same time, which is why my little project was let's just give something C++y to the compiler group to ship.
Okay, cool. Very interesting, Steven. I never knew that story. So yeah, we'll get to the fast forward part, which is the first time I heard Steven's name. I was an intern at Microsoft Research. I think I was in my between my first and second years of grad school. I was in the OS research group, and Steven was running the Windows team. So since we were the OS research group, we were like the research component kind of tacked on to the OS team. And so everyone was talking about this Sinofsky guy all the time. They would say, Sinofsky said this and Sinofsky said that. And so I just imagined this 10-foot tall person going around booming commands at all times. And I think if I got the timing correct, it was the time of the Windows 8 rewrite. And there was
what year was it?
2009.
Okay, we had just finished Windows 7 and Windows 8 was starting. Yeah.
This explains many things. But your name was said a lot with great fear and respect. And so I think because I had that insider information, I always track that project from the outside with great curiosity. So I'd love to talk about this in the context of what do you do about a successful project in a changing market? Because, there had been 7 Windowses at the time. I think that starting around 7, there were like massive changes every time. After 8 was Vista, right? So like a lot was happening with Windows. It seems like during those years. So can you tell us more about what was happening at that time, what some of the motivations were? There were a lot of the software side of things that I was hearing about that seemed pretty dramatic.
Sure. Well, I do think that the most interesting thing, of course, is like, what do you do? And the industry, we're seeing this all around right now, because now we're at sort of like the second major wave of products that are all really mature. And what do you do when a product is mature, and what's the next step? So what happened was after I did all that C++ stuff, I ended up going over to Office, and then I spent a very long time on Office. And so there's a big giant gap in this timeline. But by the time I got to Windows, it was 2006. And what had really happened was the Windows team had kind of just disintegrated. And it was a very difficult challenge. Like the team in the mid 1990s sort of split into 2 teams, not really split, like another team was created that was the modern operating system, which at the time was called Windows NT. And then there was like the Windows 95 lineage that just kept going. And so for about 8 years, we had these 2 operating systems progressing. And Windows NT was supposed to sort of be like the server operating system and move down into workstations. And Windows 90, what we called 9X, was basically supposed to go away. But it took a really long time to go away, like 7 or 8 years. But in the interim, everything shifted to the Windows NT code base. Which was great, and everything was good and happy. But it wasn't until Windows XP in 2001 that the product was usable by consumers, and we could kind of jettison the old 16-bit code. But everybody was sort of at that. Once that shipped, the company was like, in a very positive way, I would say, was like, okay, now we have to go reinvent it, because it was sort of this odyssey to get there. I mean, you're looking at basically from Windows 3 in 1990 until 2001, where we changed kernels, changed code bases, changed paradigms, went all the way to 64 bits. All of this stuff happened, and won. And we had won, and there was all this, we'd really won. You were a monopoly, you won so much, and all that stuff. But the interesting thing was the company and Bill had this foresight to say, we need to reinvent our product. The problem was, in a sense, all the directions we picked to reinvent it. Like, and by the way, the internet had appeared, and we had, come to dominate the use of the platform. Windows was how everybody got on the internet, and all that looked good. But we kind of, like, in a way, picked all the wrong things to go and reinvent. And we picked things that you could kind of argue were like, in a Fred Book's terminology, like mythical man-month, second system syndrome topics. Like we sort of went backwards and chose to reinvent all the things that were sort of good enough and didn't matter. So like it became very important to have like a whole new file system that was a database. we looked at the browser and said, okay, we won with Internet Explorer 4 and 5. So let's just reinvent the whole internet. And like, we decided that we needed a much different way to do transactions and concurrency and network routing, and also like graphics and all this other stuff. And so we had all of these huge projects, which was really no other way to describe it other than a really giant and consistent case of second system syndrome. And that became Windows Vista. And so what happened was we couldn't get anything done. And so there was like this giant reset, much like the one I talked about earlier for our tiny little project. But this was one involving 5,000 people and a huge industry, and everyone from Dell to Oracle to SQL, everybody had to reset it. And so then we got this Vista project done in about 2 years, which was sort of like, how much can we just scoop up off the floor and get out there? And that's kind of rude, but that's fundamentally what happened. And
Vista was your project too?
No, God, no, stop. Don't accuse me of that. This whole point is because I didn't work on it. But I, it's okay because I have Windows 8 that I have to admit I worked on, which half the people listening will be like, yeah, that was something. But
yeah, wait, I got the order wrong. It was Vista, then 7, then 8.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely that order. But I had joined the team right before Vista shipped, and my job was to do whatever came after Vista. So I just ignored all Vista-ness. And it launched and whatever. We could go on, and it's easy to dwell as people do on Windows 8. In fact, there was just a whole thread and Hacker News thing yesterday about Windows 8, which it's like people keep relitigating like what went wrong. But what I had to do was figure out what comes next. And the interesting thing was, this was still pre-smartphone, pre-tablet, pre-everything. We had Windows phones were going on, but Nokia dominated, and the phones weren't getting very smart very quickly. They were getting pictures, and they were browsing the weird WAP-based web, and stuff like that. But we had to rebuild the whole team, and so we'll get to that. But the big problem was Windows had just sort of hit this wall. Like, we were running in circles. Nobody knew what to do. We were just sort of moving things around. Like, if you think about it, it's sort of like the way browsers just keep reintroducing new ways to rearrange and manage tabs. Like, there's nothing, or phones, every new release of Android or iOS is like, what can we do with more widgets, sidebars, and rearrange notifications? Like, you get in that mode, you really need to stop. And so what we wanted to do was just, with all affection to Windows, we wanted to build the last release of Windows. And the reason we thought like that was because we had just done that in Office. And we had just cleared the decks and rebuilt the last version of Office, which we think of as Office 2007 today, because we were done. Like, software can finish. And so that was what we set out to do. And that was what Windows 7 was all about, was just like, let's build like the last one we need.
Noble.
And so the problem is you have all these constraints. You have compatibility, you have time, and actually the most interesting constraint that people really don't like to talk about, because in a sense, especially people listening, we're talking about ourselves, which is the biggest constraint are the tech enthusiasts, the computer scientists, the programmers, the people that know the product the best, because they have the most vested interest in basically changing the weirdest parts of it and not changing the parts that need the most changing. And so you get, like, I made fun of rearranging tabs and notifications and gadgets because those are the things that tech enthusiasts love, whereas like normal people literally don't want that stuff to change. Like, it's hard enough to figure out what I'm getting notified, or like tabs. I get it. I have a lot of them, but I don't need another way to rearrange them because like I mostly just want them all to go away.
Yeah.
And so the tech enthusiast turns out to be, when you're getting started, the biggest asset you can possibly have. And then when you want to make a big change, they are the biggest anchor to making change. And that's the hardest part about the product development in the face of change. And you see this all the time. Like, you see it with Google, you see it with feeds. Like, you see tech enthusiasts always saying in any social network, I want a chronological feed. And everybody who's worked on social networks and every normal person is like, I understand technically what you mean, but that's not how I consume things. I actually want to see things I'm interested in. But they definitely go about this with a different mindset.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So Steven, back to Windows 8. What were some of the main constraints? What were some of the major challenges or aha moments?
Well, so what we did is we built Windows 7 and it was all great. Like, we were heroes for the company. Everybody did a great job. We put Windows back on the map. It was great. And it was exactly what we wanted to get done. Also, like, one of the first, only the second release of Windows to ever ship on time, which was sort of an amazing thing in and of itself. And everything was good. But we were looking around and it was just super, super clear, even when we started Windows 7, that we really needed to do bigger and bolder things. And then by the time we started Windows 8, we were all using iPhones. And phones had really changed what computing could be. And so there were a couple of very, very important things that we really needed to change that we had to bet on. First, the user interaction model was all touch-based. And
I remember that.
And I still believe that, like, touch is just, superior for many, many things. Again, just to be tech enthusiasts for a minute, most of the people we're talking to today are sitting there looking at character mode screens. But that's not nearly everyone in the world. That's the professional programmers of the world looking at Linux prompts. But so we had the user interface model. The programming model for Windows was just dead. Like, the Win32 API was like dead. There was no one anywhere writing new Windows programs. Like, all of the Windows Win32 programming energy was found in the 98052 area code in Redmond. Like, and it was the Office team. That was it. And I had this fascinating moment where we were going through every year we go through all the countries and look at their sales. And one of the big topics was, how is Windows development doing in your country? And there was like some metric that people had to track. And India was like, we are doing great. And it was like, what had happened was everyone in the rest of the world with Windows code had outsourced it to India. And so all the Windows programming was basically in maintenance mode in India, and no one else was doing anything. And so we had to come up with a new programming model that people could use and want to use. And then the other thing that was super clear was we'd absolutely hit a wall on hardware with Intel.
Yeah.
And in particular with graphics. Because one of the things that was so amazing about the phone was how great the graphics were. And there was like this very simple thing of just rotating your screen and then everything rotating. And like, we would look at that and go, like, we can't do that on a PC. Like, the head of marketing at Intel used to come and berate us for not getting it done. And we were like, but you know that it's the graphics that you do that suck, that make this impossible. Because we actually were able to do it with like really good gaming graphics like NVIDIA, but not with like the laptops and tablets that everybody had from based only on Intel graphics. And we knew also like the phone, the battery life and the power management. So those were the things that we really set out to reinvent for the PC. And so that was those were the big bets for all of Windows.
Okay. And what's your take on, what went well about the Windows 8 rewrite and what were some of the lessons?
Well, I could fill a whole book about that. Oh, wait, I did.
That's true.
But there's no short way to say it. In fact, one of the most interesting things, like I mentioned, like literally just yesterday in Hacker News, there's like an endless thread.
Yeah, it's very complex and multifaceted project.
And people just fixate on like, oh, you got rid of the start menu. And it's like, no one is going to convince me like that was what it was. Like, because it's just not even that good of a metaphor. Like it was good at the time.
Yeah.
And now it just kind of gets in the way. And we see that. How do we know that? Because the Mac doesn't have one. And it's not like everybody's like, oh my God, I have to switch to a Mac and there's no start menu. That's not what people have ever said.
Mm-mm.
But people switch to a Mac because it doesn't have fans and it gets all day battery life.
Mm-hmm.
And, its graphics are great. Like a whole different set of attributes. Yeah. In fact, the ones I just mentioned. Oh, and by the way, the programming model is just like the phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, the shortest way I could say for what went wrong is we couldn't find a way to figure out how to build the device we wanted to build that had the attributes that the market wanted. And what the market wanted from Windows was Windows, and that's still what they want.
Yeah.
And it's so, in a way, it's kind of frustrating to be in that position. But what it wants Windows to run all of this super old software that nobody's working on, that nobody cares about. They just want that.
Yeah.
Because that's what they expect it to do. And so we built a thing that didn't run any of that, which turns out to have a lot of benefits, like battery life and no viruses, no malware and stuff like that. But people didn't want Windows that didn't do those things.
Yeah. A success failure.
A what?
A success failure. It's like when you do such a good job that then it corners you into a bad job.
And so you get stuck. And so, and I could go on. It's just not even that interesting anymore because no matter what, like it's not like I could convince, I'm great talking with just you, because if there were like 3 other people, it would all be about the start menu.
Yeah. I accepted the start menu very quickly when Windows 8 came out.
And so did everyone who would put it in front of that wasn't freaking out. But I have a whole thing on the start menu, which you could read about. But that was big. But otherwise, look, what I would really say is that I still stand by the day I handed the Surface computer to Bill with Windows 8 in the Surface box and everything. I looked at him and I still believe this, which you could call me like literally insane, which was, this is the best product Microsoft ever produced. Yeah. And it represents the best of our ability to innovate and do things.
Yeah.
Because what we had done is in 3 years, we built an entirely new operating system. We built it on chipsets that the company had never worked on.
Yeah.
And we built a computer with a whole user model and an API and a program model all at once.
Yeah. It was an incredible feat of software.
All on time.
Yeah.
So it was just like from the wrong company and too early.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right, Steven. Well, let's move on to the next question, which is teams. So you've led some teams to do pretty crazy things. You've led a range of teams to do many different things. And something that I've taken away from all of your advice is that your team has to be solid before you take them on that journey to do the crazy thing. In the words of, I guess, what I imagine your former chemistry self, there needs to be irreversible chemical bonds formed, not just, you put some people together and they just, had some physical change. So how do you like to think about the stages of team formation? And I've also heard lots of stories about just the activities you would make your teams do to really form.
What kind of activities did you hear about? I'm a little worried.
Some kind of a lot of hands-on group activities.
Yeah. Okay. Like there was no touching involved, but then
hands-on things, not each other.
I was thinking about this. You were kind enough to send me a sketch of things to talk about, and it was very interesting. So I mentioned earlier that that first team I was on, the manager of the team was this guy Jeff Harbers, who had literally just insulted the entire original Word development team, and people quit, and there were breakdowns. It was awful. And so when he came back, one of the 3 people on the team was one of the Word developers he insulted. And he had quit the Word team to join our little tiny team. And he had done all the macros in Word and all the menus. He had done a lot of stuff. And he was unbelievably brilliant programmer. And Brad and I were talking one night in the hallway. That's what we always did. We talked in the hallway. Everybody had their own private offices. And what you did is you would just stand in somebody's doorway and talk for hours on end. And so I would either do that with Brad or with Rick, alternating nights. And Brad was just like, I'm quitting. Jeff is the devil. I can't work in this group. He insulted us and whatever. So Jeff, what he did is he did this kind of classic corporate thing, which is like, we're going to do team building. And like, we all had to go to the Westin Hotel in downtown Seattle, which is this sort of dank 70s hotel, and spend like 3 days with consultants, like bonding. And it was awful. It was literally like The Office. There was nothing, like we were passing oranges under our chin to build trust. And we were doing all of these sort of cliche corporate Dilberty things. And it didn't work. Like it was still, we weren't a team yet. But what we found out very, very quickly was what makes a team is shipping software together. And so that very first project, which was like the dumb little thing that I ended up being the project lead for, was what made us a team. So we had done all of this crazy team building, and then we shipped. And that was like the most important thing. And we had gone from like infighting to like this engine. We were just cranking, and it was unbelievable. And it wasn't because of the team building, it was because of shipping. And shipping really is like the thing that builds teams.
Yeah.
And you know, like it's there are all these analogies to it, you know, and you could do battle analogies, you could do sports analogies, but in software, it's basically putting something out there that all of you worked on.
Yeah.
And watching people use it, and then reacting to that and iterating. That makes a team.
Yeah.
And so that's really what we did. And then we, if you sort of fast forward, I have there's lots of stories about building the team in Office, which is sort of why I ended up in Windows. But there was this moment shortly after that first team where the company was struggling with like being innovative and getting things done and building teams. Because what had happened was we'd been so successful with Windows 3 and that we just spawned groups all over the company. And this is going to start to sound a lot like some of the bigger Silicon Valley companies. And nobody was getting anything done. And the whole thing was, how do we innovate and deliver and blah, blah, blah. So we had this offsite that like maybe 20 of us were selected for. And this was another unbelievable Dilbert kind of thing. In fact, the entity that had done the offsite right before us was like the leadership of the US Post Office. And so we all got flown to Cape Cod. Like that's how corporate this was. Like, so we land in a big plane in Boston, then we get on like this tiny plane, like on the TV show Wings, and fly to Cape Cod. And then they take away our computers, our phones, and our wallets, so we can't even leave. And we're all at this offsite. And I have a whole story I tell about it, but it was awful. And we were supposed to do some simulation of building an economy, blah, blah, blah. And we literally broke the game and brought the facilitators to tears by not following the rules and breaking the game. But after all that, they gave us a pamphlet, and the pamphlet explained what the whole thing was about. And it was about building a team with this whole notion, this framework of storming, forming, norming, performing. It's very catchy. It's a very HR sounding thing. But I had that framework, and now it's a way of like thinking about where are you in building a team? And the whole thing is the third step is like when you finally start to ship. And then the fourth step, performing, is when you're like iterating, and you can just, you know what the left hand's doing, the right hand, everybody's happy. And once you have that framework, you kind of know how to really act. And so that really led to when I moved to the Windows team, which was like, and what you were sort of hearing the tail end of, but when we were starting Windows 7, it was just like an invasion of the Office team to the Windows team, because the Office team gone through all of these things. Like we were this disparate Word team, this Excel team. They fought like cats and dogs and hated each other, blah, blah, blah. And everybody shipped late, blah, blah, to like a giant mass of engineers that ship new releases of Office with lots of stuff on time. And so I showed up at the Windows team and it was just storming. And that really kind of upset a lot of people because they were the Windows team. And it was hard to explain, but like they weren't performing at all. Like they had just done Vista. And so I had to go through this whole process of restructuring and realigning and thinking about all the stuff. And in fact, that's literally a whole book called One Strategy that I had done. And one of the tools was writing. And so I just blogged the whole thing to the team internally. And this book, One Strategy, has like, it's basically like a live stream of reorganizing the team. And so what was so fascinating about all of that was just how you have to do so many different things. And like, you can't, it was a restructuring basically. And whenever you read about restructurings, it always just sounds like one person had this cool idea and then like they made everybody believe it and poof, they restructured or they cut all the budgets or they did whatever. But this was much more about like, we couldn't lose anything along the way. Like we still had to produce Windows in a finite amount of time and it had to run all the programs and do all the Windows things. And so, but we wanted it to be innovative and we had to work at some giant scale of like 10,000 people. So one of the many, many things I did, we wrote, and then there was a lot of like listening and meeting. I tried to talk to basically everyone on the team in some form or another, and then reflect back. And then you just sort of come back with, okay, these are the 3 things we're going to fix. Mm-hmm. And in a tech company, people think it's like, okay, you're going to fix like the loader, the network transport, and the task manager. And you're like, no, I thought we would fix like decision-making and management, and like you sort of have to meet in the middle because the Windows team was made up of those very tech enthusiasts we talked about earlier. Like those are us, like those are our people. Like to give you one example of that, like one of the teams that worked for me was called Media Center. And Media Center was this whole giant team whose job was to like make watching TV on Windows a thing. And by TV, it meant like your cable signal or your off-air signal, which involved extra hardware and making a DVR and all this other, and your CD collection, all this other stuff. And like the first time I talked to them, nobody wanted to listen to me because I worked on Word, which is like a dumb app. TV is hard and manly and it has all this stuff. And so I like, no, I actually have this whole thing set up at home and I had to produce like my network diagram of like how I set all this stuff up just to get like credibility with the team. But then finally we're done storming and we're now into forming. And so one of the things I did was like try to convince the team that you can innovate, but with a plan to innovate. And so I brought my friend from Harvard Business School, where I had taught for a semester, which was super weird because I had never even been to the business school. I was on like a tech recruiting trip and
got stuck
in 1998. And the campus, like you don't accidentally go to the business school. Like it's across the river. Like you don't trip in, and plus all the doors are locked and you need like a business school ID to get in. But I had a friend who was on the office marketing team who went to Harvard College, who after she left Microsoft went to Harvard Business School. And so we got together and she's like, you have to come to class in the morning. And I'm like, I'm on a tech recruiting trip. She's like, no worries, but I have to call the professor tonight and ask permission. And so she called him and he's like, sure, come on in. And it turns out they were doing a case on Microsoft Word.
Wow.
Which case on Microsoft Word? The one that got written about to explain when my boss, Jeff, told everybody that he was the worst manager in the world. And that was this guy's like tenure case. Like it was the one that was, and it was like all these weird coincidences. So I'm sitting in the room and they're talking about my boss, Jeff, and doing a case study about, well, Bill should have fired Jeff for saying all of those things. How could somebody tell them they're the worst team ever? And then Marco Ianzini, the professor, did like an ROI calculation of the Word development project, which at peak had like 12 developers and only made like $50 billion. So like the ROI of like pissing off one person was like infinite, basically. And so it was sort of all this very interesting, surreal thing. Marco became a friend of mine in 1998. I did a sabbatical there and taught. But then, like, fast forward to 2006 or so, and I invited him, and he did a talk for the whole of the Windows team about innovating at scale. And I feel like this was always this sort of super interesting moment because people learned from Marco about all these big projects that don't operate in a total state of chaos, like that you can actually do big things and not just have them be made up of like 150 little things that then you see what sticks to the wall. And so that was like the biggest part of like going through the storming, forming, norming, performing. Mm-hmm, and then we shipped. And then to tie it all back, it was the shipping that made everybody go, wow, I guess this could all work.
Yeah.
And and we put that to use to sort of build Windows 8.
Yeah, makes sense. All goes back to shipping. Cool. So, Steven, I have a potentially big question for you, which is you were at Microsoft for a very long time, over the course of many changes, and Microsoft itself has existed for even longer than you were there. I wanted to understand if you had insights about what made Microsoft so adaptable, because I feel like there were so many moments when Microsoft was looking at changes in the industry or changes to the reception of your own software, and there were many moments when Microsoft could have died, but Microsoft didn't. What was it about the culture or just the way people operated that led Microsoft to be so adaptable?
Well, I think that first and foremost, it was just an openness to technology. Like the company at its core is a technology company, and so if you go back, like Steve Ballmer, when he was running the company, like he embraced the first memo on software as a service, Bill wrote in 1999.
Wow.
And nobody was even using the phrase then. I've actually done all of this archaeology trying to find the origin of that phrase and who to associate it with. And it's very interesting because in the Valley, it was all called hosting or application software or service provider. And then there was a company called Marimba, which started to really talk about service infrastructure. But I really think that when you look, like Bill was really the first use of software as a service. Mm-hmm, he didn't say SaaS. It was just software as a service. Yeah. And that's actually because he was completely obsessed with the idea of having annuity revenue from customers. Yeah. Which goes back to the very first offsite I went to with Bill where we had to brainstorm about annuity. But Steve just was relentless in pushing that, and no one wanted it. Like nobody wanted software as a service from Microsoft. Like it was rejected soundly by customers from like the first products we had were in the early 2000s, and we were just grinding away. Salesforce was finding the same thing. Like Benioff was trying to do this rented software model, and it had huge benefits. Like you don't configure it, and you don't have to buy servers, and nobody wanted it. And the problem was that the people who didn't want it were the people who were CIOs during the mainframe era, and they wanted to just own stuff, and they didn't want to relinquish the control. Yeah. And nobody could get them to understand this argument about the loss of control is actually a gain of freedom. Like it's super counterintuitive. And so we sort of went through that, like focusing on the innovation and the technology that could really be delivered. And then when the market was ready, we were ready with the product. And that's really what the biggest breakthrough was around, say, 2010 to 2012 with, Office 365 and those things. And then we were, at the time, as that was starting, we started to build what does Windows as a service look like? And that's the origin of Azure. And so it was this sort of this obsession with making sure you don't lose sight of technology. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there was one thing that gave us that freedom that you really can't underestimate, and that's the product market fit that the company had. And we didn't have that word in the early 1990s, but Windows 3 achieved product market fit for Windows.
Yeah.
And, Word 6, Excel 5, the series of Office products on that's when we achieved product market fit.
Yeah.
And the literal, definition of pulling the product from the company, no matter what the company did. I mean, look, we got sued and broken up. We had lost reviews on Windows. We released like 5 versions of Windows in a row that were horrible. It just, nothing we did mattered.
Yeah.
And you really, when people write these accounts of companies, they focus on the innovation side, but you really have to remind yourself what made it possible. Like, you look at Android has been remarkably successful. Step 1, have the world's largest global search engine. Like, that's like an integral part of the success.
Yep.
And there's no escaping that.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And so the product market fit is just it just gives you so much. It gives you freedom to try whatever you want. And it gives you freedom to completely fail. I mean, the easiest way to look at it is Vista ended up being a blip. Windows 8 ended up being a blip. Now, the PC is never going to be the next big thing. Yeah. But it's fine.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right. We are nearing the end of our time. So let's do our rapid fire closing questions. First, what are the most underrated breaking changes in the industry right now? What are breaking changes people are not talking about enough?
Well, we're in a the hype part of the AI hype cycle, which means the near-term expectations are much, much higher than we will achieve, but we will achieve way more than we thought probably 10 years from now. Yep. And that's just how these things work. So we're at the 1997 internet, we're at the 1985 graphical interface, you pick, like all those things. So what that means is during the hype phase, everything is talked about. So there's nothing I can mention that hasn't already been somebody's cause. Yeah. But I do think that the two things that are the most important are going to be what happens to AI on the edge. Like all the focus, because of Wall Street, is on NVIDIA and chip companies and compute. But I don't think it's sustainable that like making AI is like some insane level of data center that the world has never seen that doesn't shrink. Yeah. That's just no technology has been like that. So, and I think even the early indications are like some of the stuff running on the phone is incredible. So I think the edge is where everything is going to end up happening. Because like the round tripping of everything just doesn't make any sense, as well as just this enormous cost of the models doesn't make any sense. The other thing is the open source models. We've never had a wave of innovation where so much deliberate energy from all scale of players is focused on open source. Yep. And that's a completely different approach. The internet was born out of open source, but very quickly became closed source because it was all in the data center. So Google was a huge champ of open source, but nothing that is Google that sells things is really open source. Yeah. It was like a distraction. Yep. Whereas now it's all out there, and that's going to fundamentally change things. Yep. Yeah. No, it makes sense. All right. So next question, good segue, is what's your hot take on the breaking changes that AI will introduce? I think right now, it's just like, I'm not going to predict anything because I'm going to be wrong, and I don't want some tape of me saying some asinine thing about the future. But I think that where we are today is in 1984, there were something like 60 different word processors that got evaluated in the list of word processors for the PC. And you look back and you're like, what the hell were people thinking? Yeah. And Microsoft was just one of them, and not even a particularly highly rated one. And so where we are now is like whatever you can think of, there's like 60 experiments going on. Yep. And that's where we should be. And everybody should be fearless about it. Because, like if you look back and we go find the founders of Xyrite or Volkswriter or Words, whatever, they were like, we're going to win. We have the best one. We are going to win. You can see this all in Halt and Catch Fire with the making of PC clones, the same mindset.
Yeah.
And so you need everybody. And this is what Silicon Valley is just so good and unique at, are running these experiments. And so I just know like a word processor is going to be different. I know a spreadsheet's going to be different. I know interacting is going to be different. I just know it's not the thing you can see today. And that's unfair, but there's just all these parts are moving. Plus, business is much more than technology.
Yeah.
Someone is going to figure out a magic formula to sales, to pricing, to distribution, to communication. And all those things have to come together because none of the winners in anything were the first.
Yeah.
The first is just the right synthesis of the parts.
Yeah.
But then you have to build out the rest of the product, price, place, and promotion to get it all right. Microsoft didn't invent the PC operating system, but it figured out the OEM model and the BIOS. And that's what really enabled the economics.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. All right. What change, personal or professional, are you excited to share with the audience for this year?
What change? I think that in the next year, the most exciting thing is going to be what we use AI for on our phones. And because right now, it's like, you could use ChatGPT with the app on your phone, but that's not using your phone. That's just using like a text console that runs on your phone. And there are some things like, will it be images? Will it be photography? Will it be video? Will it be recognition? There are so many things that we currently use that it's hard to say which is going to be the one that everybody uses. Look, everything from mapping to translation to photo image processing, all are using AI bits and pieces, but there's no sort of like AI first thing. And I think that there will be something. Yeah. I think that there will be something that will catch on in the next 12 months.
I would
think
agree.
of that way.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And Steven, I'm sure our audience wants to hear much more from you. They want to read all these books of yours that you've been talking about. Where can people find you?
You could find me on hardcoresoftware.substack.com. And that has everything there. And so I have like 110 posts and audio of the history of the PC, and then my time at Microsoft. And then I do different posts all the time. Like I just did like what went on at CES and stuff like that.
Cool. Thanks, Steven.